And great to have your insights with us. We'll assemble our panel next for their take on this. Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis are with us here on the fastest show in politics. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for being with us here on the Tuesday edition as we work our way toward the next round of voting on a continuing resolution to keep the government or reopen on Bloomberg. Really interesting conversation on this day 7 of the government shutdown with Congressman Mike Boss, the Republican from Illinois, bringing his point of view here. He chairs the VA committee and has obviously his own specific concerns, but the broader view from the Republican side of the aisle. We'll be hearing from Democrat Congresswoman Melanie Stansbury of New Mexico coming up a little bit later on this hour to balance the conversation as we prepare for the next round of voting in the U.S. Senate. It is October 7th, 2 years to the day since the attacks by Hamas against Israel that killed nearly 1,200 people and kicked off 2 years now of raging conflict. Negotiations are continuing today in Cairo. They are meeting again, even on this solemn occasion in Israel, October 7th. And at 3 p.m. today, it will ricochet back to the White House as President Trump meets in the Oval Office with Eden Alexander. You may have heard about this, the American-Israeli hostage released by Hamas in May. He will be with the president about an hour and a half from now. We mention all of this, of course, because the possibility of peace following so much destruction and death appears to be at hand, with talks underway here following the president's 20-point plan hammered out with Benjamin Netanyahu, or according to some, the arm twisting that convinced Netanyahu to accept this deal, and one that we have, I guess, conditional acceptance of, if we can call it that, from Hamas. But they are obviously continuing to talk about the release of hostages and the withdrawal of Israeli forces in Gaza. More than 60,000 people are been reported to have been killed in Gaza since October 7, 2023. And we start with our panel on this today. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us. Jeannie is Democracy Visiting Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center, our Democratic analyst, and Rick is Republican strategist and partner at Stone Court Capital. Jeannie, it's difficult to imagine what the conversation is like today in Cairo, knowing that this is the 7th of October. Does it heighten the urgency or make it more difficult to move closer to a ceasefire?
I think we all hope it heightens the urgency. And you mentioned Eden Alexander. He is, by some reports, the last living U.S.-Israeli hostage. And I think that's going to be quite a moving moment when Donald Trump meets with him at the White House today. Another, as you mentioned, in a long line of reminders of what has happened since that horrific assault 2 years ago. I hope that it does lend a sense of urgency. The problem is we have these two phases in this deal, and by all accounts, these are still indirect talks, which is problematic, but it's also problematic that we haven't had yet out of Hamas an acceptance of both of these phases of the deal. If you just look at phase 1, for instance, the release of the hostages and then a movement back of Israel, still within 4 miles in Gaza, that yellow line of the Trump administration's map. The problem is Hamas has never wanted to agree to that. They've wanted total withdrawal by Israel. So we have some ways to go, but I think there is some reason to hope because the entire world seems to be pushing Hamas to accept this deal.
What is your thought today, Rick? It's a reminder, of course, about how this started, but also it tells us how long this has been going on and how important it is for us to find resolution here. Will this group meeting in Cairo manage to get this done?
Well, it's certainly the closest step we've seen since the attacks of October 7th 2 years ago. And it really has ushered in a profound change in the Middle East. You look at this right now in a vacuum as a negotiation between the Israelis and Hamas. But the reality is it incorporated a region-wide war that has been perpetrated with Israel taking out Hezbollah, fighting actively to weaken the Yemeni groups that have been supportive of Iran, an attack actually on the country of Iran. I mean, like when you think about Syria changing leadership, I mean, we are in a different world than we were 2 years ago when this attack took place, and I think that's the reason that you might actually see peace here, because there's no retreat. Iran's its weakest point. There's not really active support for Hamas. Hamas has taken on enormous losses, and there's no future for the people of Palestine without a resolution of this conflict. And so pressure is on. And I have to give credit to Donald Trump for keeping Netanyahu in the game, right? To forcing him to a negotiation that otherwise he probably would not be actively involved in. And the U.S. is Israel's last significant ally, and without us, there would be no peace.
You wonder what's next here, Jeannie. We're obviously marking October 7th today, but I just saw Marco Rubio on the couch in the Oval Office with the president. We know that Steve Witkoff and indeed Jared Kushner have both also been instrumental in getting us to this point. Who's leading the charge on this White House diplomacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think Witkoff and Kushner have been paramount. Obviously, you mentioned Marco Rubio, Secretary of State. So, I think Witkoff, who has had an awful lot on his plate, and Kushner are really been able to deal, to Rick's point, with Netanyahu. But let's remember what these talks are being described as right now, yesterday and today, as technocratic talks. Really talks about this first phase, like things as basic as the sequencing. Does Hamas have access to the hostages, both living and deceased, in order to fulfill, if they decide to, their end of this deal? And yet again, Hamas has still not agreed to any of that. And so we do have a ways to go. And speaking of Netanyahu, he is feeling pressure both internally and externally. We have these really striking polls from Israel in the last day or so showing that about 2/3 of Israelis are saying that Netanyahu should take responsibility for the attacks and resign. We're seeing that a good substantial portion believe that Israel has committed genocide. Those numbers are reflected by Israelis or Jews who live in the United States. And of course, the White House is seeing those polls as well. So there is a lot of pressure on Netanyahu. But of course, there's a lot of pressure on the Hamas political wing as well, because what are they going to have to do? They are going to have to sign their death warrant. And that is going to be very hard for any individual or group to do. But that's essentially what would have to happen for this deal to go through.
Do you mean political death warrant, Jeannie?
Sorry about that. Absolutely, political death warrant, because this says that they are disarmed, that there may be amnesty for fighters who denounce violence, but that the group itself will be disbanded and have no role in a potential future Palestinian state. And that is, as you can imagine, just like individuals, states act the same way. Very, very hard to imagine that the political and military end come to an agreement on that. They may, but they would be signing their own political death warrant there.
It does certainly sound like it. Rick, I'm assuming you look at it this way as well, as obviously Benjamin Netanyahu does. He's calling for the elimination of Hamas. To what extent does that lead to a potential rebranding, however, with political leaders in Gaza assuming the role of leadership in some other group?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it goes without saying that Prime Minister Netanyahu said at the time, 2 years ago, that the operation that he will overtake is the complete and total destruction of Hamas. And that has not happened to today. There are still people who would be considered leaders there, and they're the ones currently negotiating. Jeannie makes a good point. I'm not sure it's a political point. It actually is a death warrant for these individuals, because we only have to remember the 1972 Munich Olympic massacre, and Israel at that time said the same thing. We will hunt down the people who did this, and we will destroy them. And Operation Wrath of God did just that. It took decades, But at the end of the day, the people who perpetrate this attack 2 years ago on Israel will feel the wrath of Israel. And so this is a heavy negotiation. There'll be efforts to try and get leadership sanctuary in other cities, but they all know what we know, which is that Israel will always look for opportunities to vanquish their enemies who perpetrated these horrible crimes on their people. And that has got to be part of the negotiation that's going on today. And so, yes, there are a lot of technical issues that have to be figured out. The 20-point plan is not even close to being a comprehensive plan. But at the end of the day, all parties are now in one location hashing this out, which we have not seen happen heretofore. And I think the world is keeping pressure on these groups to try and come to an end to this carnage that's been going on now for 2 years.
It's an important moment, Jeannie, in our final minute here in our conversation. Would the political leadership of Hamas then, following the signing of any deal, essentially just go into hiding in Doha? They can never go back to Gaza, right?
Yeah, I think that's an open question, and it's a really important one, because what history shows us is that any time you destabilize a leadership, whether you describe it as evil or tyrannical or democratic or otherwise, another group is going to come in and fill that power gap. Mm-hmm. And that group can be worse than the group that preceded it. We've seen that repeatedly. And of course, as the leading democracy in the world, we must always remember we do owe to the Palestinians a right of self-determination as to how they live peacefully.
Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis tackling some heady issues with us today on Balance of Power, and I thank you both for the insights, and we'll keep you posted on talks in Cairo. We're back to the government shutdown next in our conversation with Congresswoman Melanie Stansbury, only here on Bloomberg. The two